Hello. In this video, I want to introduce to you for this second stream of our TEI workshop a manuscript collection that covers many different genres. So if you want to learn TEI and its full range of capabilities, this is a good collection that encapsulates many of them. Now this is an advertisement page, which is quite similar to the title page of a book that was published in 1834, The Bow and the Cloud, or The Negro's Memorial. And this was a collection of contributions written by both professional and non-professional writers to commemorate the abolition of slavery in the British colonies following the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. And as you can see here on this advertisement page, there are some names listed who at the time were pretty well known, including Lord Morpeth and the MP Thomas Buxton, but also several religious figures, some fairly well-known poets like James Montgomery and Anne Gilbert, and a fairly famous publisher, Josiah Conder, Thomas Pringle, who was the secretary of the London Anti-Slavery Society, and Jane Roscoe, who was the wife of the famous Unitarian Roscoe, who is one of the fathers of the abolition movement. Right. So what is less known about this collection is that it was edited by a woman who founded the Sheffield Ladies Anti-Slavery Society with a group of other anti-slavery activists in the 1820s, and she was the one who edited this collection, and she did all of the work, including soliciting contributions from many kinds of writers and collecting them and editing them, as we shall see. This interesting letter from one of her contributors, Mary Sterndale, indicates that Rawson's planning had seemed to pay off, and that came with it what she called a definitive object, a solidity of purpose. So what's interesting is that we not only have this collection of anti-slavery writings edited by Marianne Rawson, but also a variety of genres from a variety of different grassroots anti-slavery activists who wanted to commemorate this event through literature. I'm showing here a portrait in the National Portrait Gallery of the Anti-Slavery Convention of 1840 by Benjamin Hayden, which actually shows Marianne Rawson fairly prominently displayed here on the right-hand side, sitting alongside other anti-slavery luminaries. She was quite a prominent figure at this time. And what's particularly interesting about this collection is that she decided to keep everything, or as much of everything as she could keep, in the making of this book. So here, for example, we've got the image on the title page commemorating William Wilberforce. And there's actually the original watercolor that formed the woodcut image in the manuscript collection, for example. There are all kinds of letters in the manuscript collection, including this one from Henry Corbould, who provided that image that I just showed, but there's also correspondence by him, including how much he charged for the image that you just saw. There are other interesting examples too of things that were omitted from the book. And we can get this information through the manuscript archive. So for example, in this poem, The Mother, we have here a couple stanzas, but in the manuscript collection, we'll see that the writer of this poem actually submitted her own drawing to go with the poem. And unfortunately, it was not included in the book, but it was saved in the manuscript archive. Here's another example of an unused illustration from another poem. Another thing that we have here is evidence of composition, of revision. This here is Marianne Rawson's two preface drafts On the left-hand side, you can see a fairly messy draft. And on the right-hand side, an attempt at a fair copy that is further revised. In addition to evidence of revision, we also have things like this note, which apparently was meant for the preface. And it's particularly interesting because in this case, Rawson is trying to figure out what her role is as the editor of this volume. So she indicates that she won't apologize to the public or anything, and that she's taking a higher ground and advocating for this collection and her role within it. Now, it should be said that ultimately she did not publish this note, and she actually erased all references to the fact of her being a woman in the published version. So the revision process that went into her own preface writing is fairly interesting. We also have other interesting letters, for example, from the Reverend J.W.H. Pritchard, suggesting changes to the preface of The Bow and the Cloud. And as you can see here, she did adopt some of his changes. We also have evidence of revision on the part of Rawson. Here we've got James Montgomery's prose piece, Leonard Dober, which is about the Moravians' missionary work in the Western Hemisphere in the 18th century. And here's Rawson doing a fair copy of Montgomery's revised manuscript submission. Here is an extract that was written by the Reverend Thomas Buxton. It came in a letter, which is shown here, and the beginning of the extract is indicated by an X mark, which is circled in red here, and the end of the extract on the third page occurs here with the other X mark. And what Rawson did was, as she often did with other pieces, is she copied out a fair copy in her own hand. And as you can see, she actually made further revisions. But she made even more revisions. On the back of another manuscript leaf, she penciled in a new beginning to that extract and made further revisions. So what we have here is evidence of all kinds of revisions done by Rawson as the editor. And we also have all these other layers of composition, from the original letter submission to Rawson's fair copying manuscripts, to her further revising it en route to book publication. And we see other interesting kinds of multimedia text here. So I mentioned Thomas Pringle earlier, who was the secretary of the London Anti-Slavery Society. He submitted some interesting pieces, including a poem that also made use of a prose extract that came from a newspaper piece, but he revised the newspaper piece. So this would be quite an interesting piece to edit digitally. Other things that were left out, for example, this poem about Toussaint Louverture, which of course is the Haitian revolutionary. And this poem was likely not included in the collection because it was a fairly violent poem, but of course, but also Toussaint Louverture was a bit of a controversial figure at the time. And ultimately, the collection as published avoided controversial subjects as much as it could, possibly because it saw itself as more of a commemoration rather than an agitation toward universal abolition at the time. Other instances of revision and suppression of certain material are shown here in this poem, where the imagining of a planter's final moments are fairly dark and were left out. Same here for the diptych, for the second piece of this diptych, The Slave's Last Hour, also not included. Here we've got an example of a poem that actually had cuts in it. So here we've got asterisks in the printed version of the poem. that in manuscript were actually written out and were left out by Rawson. And here we can see that the first stanza in the published version actually occurred in the fourth stanza of the manuscript version. So another example here too is a fairly violent poem about the reign of terror that is Slavery, a fairly dark poem with fatalistic undertones that was also left out. And here too we've got an interesting example of a letter with a poem enclosed within the letter, which does suggest some interesting issues that digital editors need to deal with. Skip through this and you can look at these slides in your own time. But I just wanted to finish by showing also that one of the most interesting omissions in this manuscript collection were letters that were written by fairly famous poets at the time who declined to contribute, the most prominent of whom was William Wordsworth. And I highlight here in red one of the more striking passages in his letter, including his belief that slavery was actually not one of the worst things that were done by humans. And like many other conservatives of the time, he was worried about the effect of on the planters by universal abolition. But on a more positive note, I suppose, here is a letter, an unpublished letter by John Clare, indicating that he thought slavery was an abominable traffic and a disgrace to Mohammedanism and Christianity and so on. And it's a pity Clare in this poem, or sorry, in this letter, made it clear that he wanted to submit a poem, but this was during a period in his life when he was very much on the move. And unfortunately, we have no record of his sending a poem. And so all we have is this letter, which has a gem in it about his opinion that slavery is abominable. No poem, however, but because Marianne Rawson saved all of this information, we can make these interesting historical judgments about its contents and the complexity of its documents and the making of the book.
Great. Can I ask a quick question, Christopher?
Sure.
Is the archive that you describe all in one place, all in one institution now?
Yes, I should have made that clear. Yes, it's in the John Rylands Library at University of Manchester.
Right. And I ask because I wonder, is there any other material that would be either directly or indirectly relevant to this collection, which is held in other institutions or private collections or anything similar that one might imagine bringing together with it? Because one of the nice things about digital publishing, of course, is that you can create virtual collections from different places. So
that's right.
What the potential there might be.
Yeah, well, because of the nature of this collection, namely that it's multi-author, multi-genre, it'd be hard to answer that definitively, because you could branch off into other collections dealing with other of these figures who contributed, including Wordsworth. But certainly you're right. There's a Marianne Rawson collection, for example, in Sheffield, in the Sheffield City Library Archives, I believe, or maybe at the University of Sheffield. I'm forgetting off the top of my head, but there's another collection in Sheffield. There's also a very prominent collection of ladies' anti-slavery material in Nottingham. And there's certainly a lot of material in London relating to anti-slavery societies. So yes, there could be a really good virtual collection to come out of it. And one of the things that I'm interested in with this collection is creating a network graph that connects all of these things in terms of their subjects and their places and so on.
And yeah, cross-references in particular to things. I'm just thinking, you have letters that were received by the editor, but there may be letters that were sent by the editor that are in other collections because they're in the collection of the person who received them and so forth. Yeah, no, nice. And so we'll be offering the opportunity to the students to edit some of the documents from that collection in TEI, which sounds fun. Great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks.